Here we are already at lesson 5, and it's a fun lesson because now the 7 compass blocks are all going to come together, and I've got a couple of new techniques, matching 6 points. First of all, matching 3 points with the border print, and then doing set inseams, the dreaded set inseams that are not really nearly as bad as people make them out to be. So we're going to start by talking about the 3 points matching with the border print. When we did lesson 3, when I showed you how to join 3 points, when we lined the pieces up, we were lining the cut edges because we had the exact 1/4 inch on the pieces, so we were lining the cut edges exactly up. Now we've cut the same size triangles here on these pieces with the border print. You're going to have these border print hexagons in the middle of each one of the compass points. So this time we cannot just line up the cut edges. Why? Because it's more important to line up the design on the border print. And you'll find that nothing, unless you're doing wallpaper or something where they're printing on a flat surface like paper, otherwise with fabric it's fluid and it's not going to be exactly the mirror image on one side as on the other. So even though you cut with the seam allowance the way you're supposed to and all, it may not exactly work. So instead what I'm doing is lining up the design, because that's the most important thing. You want the design to work. And once I get that design, I'm going to put a pin in there. Then I'm going to come up here. You'll find that the cut edges aren't exact, but where it makes up for overlap on one cut edge, you're going to have another cut edge that'll go the opposite direction. I don't know if that makes sense, but so I'll have a slightly more on the back one here, but on the one on the other side it'll be slightly more on the front one. So I do exactly the same. You don't have to see me sew it again. I sew this up to the point, don't break the thread, do a little back stitch, take the pin out, pivot it, come down, line it up again, the design, not just the patch, the design, and go down the next side. So it's exactly what we did with the 3 points, and here I have a piece that's finished, and you can see how this design matches. I'm trying to see if there's one spot where it doesn't quite, because this is really minor, but these little stripes right here don't quite exactly line up. The orange stripe is slightly below. When that happens, you can, what I call, you can scooch it a little bit. So I'm just going to take this in my hand, and I'm going to take my thumb and kind of push that top piece, just push it along to the end of the piece. And you can't do this with machine sewing, but you can do it with hand sewing. Kind of manipulate it a little bit. And once I did that, I don't know if you can see or not that close up, but the lines now exactly line up. So scooching, that's a new word for you to learn this time. So there's an excellent video on the website about inset seams, doing them both by machine and by hand. And rather than me going through that all again, I would refer you to that. You have the link here in your pattern and also on the screen where you go to on the website, and it'll be on the Stellaris page. So what's going to happen here, this is an inset seam that we're going to have to sew. You see that seam here? Remember where we joined those 3 points together? So that's an inset seam, and we have to sew that in here. Now again, I mentioned this once before, we want to sew from the border print side because you can use the line from the border print as a guide for sewing these pieces together. So I'm going to sew like this. Going to line up the dots with that dot in the center. So you don't really see the dots when, you know, I'm sure from the distance, but they are there. So that's the most important thing about getting the accuracy, is to line up these dots. So once I've got that, I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to push it in, pull it back until it just snaps off all of that seam. Comes up right at the dot, not quite on the back side. I didn't quite get that just right. You have to make sure it comes up on the dot on both the front and the back. So if it doesn't, just take it apart, unpin it, try again. That felt a little more like it. Yeah, so now what I'm going to do is match the dots at this end. So I'm going to match the dots at this side, and then I'm going to start sewing. So I have now the line from the border print as a guide. I'll start at the dot, but then I'm just going to sew right along that line from the border print. Now, by hand, I've got all the seam allowances to my left. I'm going to take an extra big stitch, pull it back until I can feel it sort of snap off that, and then remove the pin, and I'm going to do a back stitch there. Just a little back stitch, putting it in, pulling it off again. And now I'm going to pivot this. Bring it around, match up the dots on this end. And now I'm going to go through the seam, push all the seams to my right, and push really tight against that seam, like I'm digging down underneath, and come up, and I've got that end pinned already, so I just continue down this side. All right, so that's the inset seam on these pieces. You do 2 of these, make 1/2 and then another half, and you see how that just flows around the corner there. You don't see it as well with the border print, but there you have that. And what the next thing is going to happen is we'll sew the 6 pieces together, getting 6 points to meet at the center. In an earlier lesson, I showed you how you get 3 points to meet perfectly. Even when you kind of tug them a little bit, there's no gap in there. If you want 6 points to meet, you have to do that on both halves. They have to be exact matching. Now, in order for you to be able to see what I'm doing to get these 6 points to match, I'm using fabrics that are more high contrast so you can see that. The first thing I'm going to do is put all the seam allowances to the outside of this section. You see how they're all going away, so that as I line up the points, there's no seam allowance inside. So the first step is to line these points up exactly. And then the important thing is to pin properly, and sometimes I'll have to pin several times to get it just right. I'm going to take my pin. I've got seam allowance all going away from the center, and I think I've matched them exactly. I'm going to put a pin in, go beyond that center point, and pull it back until I feel it kind of snap off. And I'll look on the back side, and actually it looks pretty good. It's come out right where those 2 seam allowances cross on the back and on the front as well. So that's ready to put a couple more pins in. And what I'm going to do is I'll start at the edge. I'll go to the center when I'm doing it by hand. I don't break the thread. Pull all the seam allowances to the right so I don't sew on top of them. Do a couple of back stitches. Come through the top and over to the next side. So let me show you how I do that. The important thing is that pinning in the center, because it's come out right at the point we're aiming for, and that's where I'm going to aim my stitching, right at that point. Now, I've approached the center. I'm going to pull all the seam allowances to my left. And now, as I'm there, I'm going to go do an extra big stitch, pull it back till it can snap off the bulk of all those seams, and it's coming out right where my pin was. Then I'm going to take the pin out because I don't really need that anymore. I can take this pin out too. I'm going to do an extra big little stitch, do that same thing that I did the first time. So I do it twice to make sure I have it nice and tight. Then I'm going to take all the seam allowances and push them to the right. I'm going to come over here, come through the base of all those seams right here on top of my thumbnail, and then the seams are now all to my right. I'm going to push against them, dig down, turn, and come up the next side. And hopefully, when we open it up, we'll have 6 points meeting perfectly in the center. We shall see. Now, we'll open it up, and you'll see where those come together in the center. Sewing these pieces together is exactly the same as the 6 points that I just joined. So I'm not going to take the time to actually sew it, but it still is very important. Instead of just matching the cut edges, I mean, I'll sort of pin it for you here. We pin the points so that they exactly come together just the same way as we did before, but now we're matching the designs. I'm going to stick a pin in the middle. And then for the rest of it, you also have to match the design, not the cut edges. So we're going to make sure this design matches that design. Just match the design of the two pieces that we're sewing together and finish that unit. And when you do, let me just open this out, we'll have this unit like this. You know, I just not taking the time to sew it. And then these other units that we put together earlier, here we have another set-in seam exactly like what we just did, and another set-in seam exactly as we just did here. And you'll have a completed block. Here's one of the other ones that's already now completed. So that's what your job is this time, is to complete all these blocks, and then we've got some fun coming next month.